early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" Then they said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they could receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I'm generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Hear what the Spirit is saying.
Thanks be to God. willing to send animals to families and towns and villages around the world so that people can feed themselves. Hi. How are you? What does fair mean? Yes, Howard? Oh. Yeah, it could be a place that has all kinds of rides. I was thinking more about like when a kid says, "Hey, that's not fair." How about that? What's that? Yes. When someone else has something better than another person has, what would you like to say? Yeah, like the story we just read, she said, where people who worked all day got paid the same as people who only worked 3 hours. All day was 9 hours. People that came in late got paid the same amount of money. What does fair mean in your lives? Have you ever said, "Hey, that's not fair"? One day you were playing with your friends, and they said, "That's not fair"? Yeah. Do you remember what it was? One of your friends had a better toy than the rest of you did? Anything else? You ever say that? Do you ever say, "Hey, that's not fair"? I had 5 brothers and a sister in my family when I grew up, and when we were all kind of little, my mom sometimes would bring out dessert. She always made dessert. Back then we sat at the table, we ate supper, and then we always had dessert. My mother always made dessert. Sometimes she would make, a piece of cake or a pie. And when the supper was over, all of us leaned in really close. You know why? We watched my mother take the knife and cut the pie or cut the cake, because we were ready in a moment. Guess what? If we saw that one piece was bigger than the other, and the drama went up, it's like, uh-oh, she didn't do a very good job cutting them all the same. And did you hear me tell you how many of us there were? There were 7 of us, kids, leaning in around the table. Then she would take the server and she would scoop it up, and if it was the small piece, everybody leaned back. And if it was the big piece, everybody leaned in. And we knew then there was going to be some dessert eating, but we also knew somebody was going to be really happy, somebody was going to be really mad. And eventually, no matter what, when the small piece, the smaller, and by smaller, I mean it might have been that much smaller. When the small piece went on the plate, somebody would say, "Hey, that's not fair." Can you say it with me? Come on, say the whole thing. Ready? "Hey, that's not fair." Come on, say it with me. Ready? "Hey, that's not fair." And my mother would say, "Come on, eat what's in front of you and enjoy it." But somebody, sometimes it was me, would sit there with my piece in front of me. Now all of a sudden it wasn't going to taste good. Because because what? Because my brothers and sister were being mean? I don't know. It's just it didn't feel right. Why should they get more than me? I don't know either. And I still don't know. But what I've learned is now, when I sit at the table and somebody's serving food, especially if it's homemade food, you know how I've changed since I was a kid? I just eat and be really happy. Because, man, that is great to have somebody make dessert for you. Right? pay attention too much anymore. Not too much, at least around dessert, about who gets the bigger piece. Today, Jesus told that story about the workers in the field and the fair and not fair, only to make one really big point. God, you know who I'm talking about when I talk about God, right? God, the one who made everything, the one from whom everything came, has shared everything we have with us freely. Freely. And when our eyes are open, when we look around in a really good way, sometimes things aren't fair, but God wants us to see the gifts we have, to see what's in front of us, to enjoy the gifts that are in front of us today. Thank you for coming up and sharing with me your comments and your thoughts. Sometimes I think I'll stop preaching the parables of Jesus. Because when you engage them, when you listen to them, they are sometimes very disturbing. They're disturbing and they seem to worm their way into your mind and you think about it. Maybe you're familiar with the parable of the prodigal son, the prodigal child, who takes the father's inheritance and goes off to a far land and squanders it. And after squandering it and losing his way, losing everything that he had, he decides it's better to come back and be a servant on his father's farm. When he gets there, the father runs to meet him and reestablishes him as a son, beloved, kills the fatted calf, and has all of his friends in for a party. And the other son who stayed, toiling in the field, feeling now totally resentful. But the one who was wayward not only seemed to have the easier path, but almost seemed to get a bigger reward. And then Jesus tells this story. He's always struggling. Jesus is always struggling in this image of God, bringing the people of God to a better understanding of who God is. And I always feel like I'm in defense of the Bible, especially the Hebrew Scriptures. I always feel like my life is spent being apologetic, being an apologist for the Old Testament, and the idea that in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, there is an angry God who is giving out a list of things that you ought to do, and if you don't do them, then somehow you're going to reap the punishment of God. Jesus is constantly trying to stir up the minds of the religious leaders of his time with a different concept of God, one that he believes comes more genuinely from Abraham and Sarah, which is more genuinely the Hebrew, or the Jewish version of God, is a God who created the world out of joy and generosity, a God who hid bountiful things, the minerals under the earth, the water in all kinds of places, the rain that falls, Jesus says, on the just and the unjust. They all get their gardens watered. Because God is not a withholding God. God is a generous God. A God from whom generosity flows by God's very nature. God is a God of grace and mercy and long-suffering patience, much more than we could ever be. And most of us know that God is merciful. We know that God is generous. But we live in a different world. We live where records are kept. We live where accounts are kept. And it has to be that way. We live in an organized world where you get this because you worked hard, and that means you got this, and you knew that's what it was going to be. And we work under contracts and bargains and arrangements. And the one thing we can't really tolerate is we can't tolerate someone not fulfilling the bargain that they had agreed to. But even more unsettling, more disturbing, unearthing in our life is someone who does more than they were contracted to do. A few years ago, I worked down in Appalachia as a part of the Appalachian Service Project, which is a great Methodist institution, in honor of our guest today, who is a Methodist pastor. And in that week that we worked, we were completing a fifth week of work with a family that their neediness and their struggle in life was overwhelming. They had, it was an elderly woman and her husband who had kind of adopted their grandchildren, two of whom were medically needy, I mean severely medically needy children. And the parents, one of them had died, the other one was lost in drug addiction, and the grandparents had extended their arms and their heart when they were raising these children. And they had no money. The grandfather had black lung from working in the mines. He couldn't work, and she was barely getting by on the kinds of things she was able to do in the house. And the Appalachian Service Project identified them as a family that should be helped. This is a family that really needed incredible amounts of help. And so they began to pour resources into the family's life. They began to work with them, and they found a place where they could reconstruct a home for them. Their home was a shambles. I can't even describe for you the place where this little group were living. No sanitary conditions at all, nothing. Barely had fresh running water. And so we went in and we began to work, and the teams before us had worked. And we had gotten to a certain place where things were going really well. New sheetrock in new walls, an addition built onto the trailer, and a room for each of the kids so they could have some privacy. And after we left, the week after we left, on the notice that we get from the Appalachian Service Project, we learned that the neighbors in the community had gotten together and burned the place to the ground. And you can think ill of them if you want to. But I just want you to pause for a moment before you pass too much judgment on them. Because everyone in that community was suffering. Everyone was struggling for where their food would come from. Everyone's roofs were leaking. Everyone's children did not have clothes. They were together and they were watching what they thought was an unjust unfolding of generosity. There was, I see your heads nodding, you understand, right? There are these situations in which when generosity comes, and when it's a wonderful story for some, what it does is it makes those in the context of generosity begin to feel like they are a zero with the rim knocked off. And when they got together and they talked among themselves, I'm sure that on reflection afterwards, they probably are appalled at what happened. They were probably shocked when they saw the wreckage the following morning of what they had done. But somehow inside them deep was a sense of justice and a cry for help for themselves that they didn't really know how to respond differently except to say, that's not fair. It's not fair. It's a similar kind of context in this story. You see, when you think about the workers, the story that's unfolded is there was a vineyard owner who had a vineyard. He needed a lot of work done in the vineyard. He was going to reap the grapes, harvest the grapes, and make wine, and he would produce a tremendous amount of income. And so he went out looking for harvesters to work in the field. But where he went, you know, maybe if you've ever lived in an urban center, you know where the day laborers hang out. You know that you go down to the day laborer corner, and there they are. They've just gotten a cup of coffee in the morning, and they stand there. And they do nothing but stand and wait. And they pray together that somehow somebody who needs work for the day will come by and hire them for one day. It's not a promise of a daily job every day. It's just one day. And in the contract of the commitment, the laborers know that those who pick them up will agree to pay them enough money so they can survive for one more day. And in Jesus' time, it was no difference. A denarius was enough money to buy 3 meals for one person for one day. And so when the vineyard owner arrives and sees all these people in the marketplace waiting for work, his heart goes out to them, and if you didn't notice, he takes them all. He takes everybody that's there, and he sweeps them out into the vineyard, and they must have felt pretty good at 9 o'clock in the morning, because they had a job. You know, in recovery, they talk about taking one day at a time. Well, there's a discipline for you. Be happy that you've got this day and the promise of one day's wages for this day. Don't worry about tomorrow. And they're working, earning a living wage for one day. And then the landowner goes back to the day labor site, the corner in town, and lo and behold, some more workers have come. And it's now noon. And the vineyard owner says, do you want to work? And they say, of course we want to work. We want to live. We want to be alive. Many of us are not used to living at this base level of life. Maybe you've touched on the bottom of it at some point in your life, but for most of us, we don't really know what it is like to be a single mom with 2 kids coming into the Kumek Echo food pantry, hoping that there's enough food in there for the family to be able to survive for just 2 more days. not only do we not know this in our personal experience, but we don't really want to know about it. They said, of course we want to work. And so the landowner, the vineyard owner said, come on with me, and I'll pay you what's fair. And then the landowner went back at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and lo and behold, there were still some people there looking for work. I don't know anything about what happened in the lives of those people who showed up at 3 o'clock. I don't know, maybe they had arthritis and they can't move until 2 in the afternoon. Maybe they didn't get enough food from yesterday so that when they went to get up, they couldn't even get themselves organized, but they managed by 3 o'clock in the afternoon to scrape their way to the work corner, and there they were, hoping against hope. Nobody ever calls anybody to work at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and lo and behold, the vineyard owner shows up, and there they are, and he takes them all. He takes them to the vineyard, and they go to work, and all of them work until 6 o'clock, and then the vineyard owner says to the shift manager, here's what I want you to do. I want you to pay. By the way, it was a legal requirement in that time, in that economy. An employer was never allowed to keep 1 day's wage from the worker. If a worker worked 1 day, you had to pay them at the end of every day. Every day. Primarily that's because in Roman-occupied Jerusalem, you needed to pay today to pay for food for tonight and tomorrow. And so the manager calls them up and says, okay, I want all those of you who showed up at 3 o'clock to come forward. And he began to hand out denarius to all. And there was a rumor of excitement that went through the place among the 12 o'clock workers and the 9 o'clock workers, because they thought to themselves, woohoo! If he is paying a denarius for having worked from 3 to 6, what is he going to pay to those who have worked from 12 to 6? And the 8 o'clock workers and 9 o'clock workers said, and you think you're excited? What about us? What about us? We've been here since 9 o'clock this morning. Can you imagine what he's going to pay us? I might take tomorrow off. I get a paid vacation of 1 day. And when the 12 o'clock workers are paid, they're paid in denarius. And when the 9 o'clock workers are paid, they're paid in denarius. 1 day's pay for 1 day's work. And there's something in us. There's something in us. It's in me. I'm sure it's in you too. There is this struggle. I feel like I'm transported back to that table with my family, and something that nobody taught me, that to look, to see, to make sure that my brothers and sisters were not getting more than I was. We also were a family that knew somewhat of what poverty was, but that's not what this was about. This was about place and position. This was about a sign that maybe mom loved him better than me. There are all these things that go on around in my mind, and I struggle with this text, and I say to Jesus, that's not fair. It's not fair. And in some ways, in the way our world works, it isn't. It's that same thing that boiled up in those residents around that needy family. I could go back and make the case that they were more needy, but it's not fair. In a surprising way, in a way that turns our whole world upside down in the way we live, Jesus said, the generosity of God is not fair. Mercy and grace don't come to us because they're fair. That's why they're called mercy and grace. Mercy and grace aren't about getting what you deserve. They're about getting what you never deserve.
Jesus was always trying to direct human beings, then and now, out of the daily struggles of our concerns of self-preservation, and instead directing us upward and outward to a reliance and a faith and a trust in God, who produces fruit on the trees and grain from the ground. Jesus was always trying to get us to back up away from our limited vision of what are the essential things of life, and help us to understand that all creation is based on a generosity which is overflowing. There's a company in Massachusetts, Arthur DeMoulis, who is the executive owner of a company. Interestingly, it's a supermarket company. It's called Market Basket. It's not this one. But Market Basket is a chain in Massachusetts, and Arthur DeMoulis started the chain, I think, about 20 years ago. He built this supermarket chain to a place where from this work, his personal net worth is $675 million. He has been an enormously successful operator of grocery stores. But here's the amazing thing about his success. From the very beginning, Arthur DeMoulis made sure that every single person, full-time and part-time, they paid for their health care. He made sure that the hours that were worked in his grocery store were workable for people who lived in different stages of his life. He was like the manager in this story. He was deeply involved in the lives of his employees. And when you talk to the employees of the Market Basket, they will tell you they actually got the sense that the man who was running this huge money-making company actually loved his employees. And what he loved about being the CEO of this massive company was he loved the opportunity to be generous with them even beyond their work. He's had a personal commitment that somehow he had been put in a place where because of their work, great resources were given to him, and he was able to return them to them. This is a traded company on the stock market, and it is enormously successful, or at least it was until this summer. This summer, Arthur DeMoulis' cousins, who served on the board, and other members of the board of directors fired him. They fired him because while the sense of well-being among the employees was really good, they thought they could do better for the stockholders. And when they fired him, they rolled back all the principles of generosity that were a part of his employment practices. And it happened so fast. This just happened this summer. But it happened so fast that in the supermarkets, the workers refused to go to work and the people refused to shop. Because part of what Arthur DeMoulis did in his negotiations of generosity was he made sure that in the neighborhoods that were the poorest, the prices were lower. He actually tailored his work in the vineyard to meet the needs and the lives of the people from whom he was called to serve. And it all came crashing down. 1 month after he was fired, Arthur DeMoulis took $1 billion from his personal savings and bought the company back. He bought the company back. And he insisted that the principles of the way he ran the company were not just some far-flung idea, but they were actually built into the fabric of well-being from a God who is actually generous and loves and cares for the people of the earth. Aren't you glad that every company we deal with feels that way? Aren't you glad that that's the world we live in today? Friends, listen to me. You can lament all you want to the stinginess and the greediness that you see in the world today. You can spend all week and all month marking out how people are only concerned for themselves and they want only to build their own personal wealth. But in the end, it's that old principle: if you want to live in a world that is different, you have to be different. You want to be known as a follower of the God that Jesus Christ loved. Be generous, my friends. Be generous. That's really the offense that the vineyard owner committed. He didn't want the workers who'd shown up at 12 and at 3 to have worked for 3 hours and then starved to death. Is that so bad? Generosity turns it all upside down. That's why Jesus said at the end, first shall be last, and the last shall be first. God is a generous God. And I believe that in the world, the dog-eat-dog world in which we live, that it is harder for us to accept the generosity of God than it is for us to struggle with the images of God's justice. Friends, you may not have figured it out, but in the story that Jesus told, those that were listening, do you know who you are in the story? You and I, we are the Johnny-come-latelys. We are the ones who've shown up late. We are the ones who have received what we do not deserve. We are the ones who have experienced the generosity of God even in our difficult times. And Jesus is calling us to be grateful, to live lives of thanksgiving, and that we, as we try to point to this generous God, that we ourselves will be grateful. Massachusetts is not that far away.